Montreal under siege. Protesters in Montreal turned violent on Friday night, burning an effigy of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, giving Nazi salutes, chanting genocidal slogans, and vandalizing the Palais des Congrès during a NATO summit. Police dispersed rioters using tear gas and pepper spray, with 3 arrests made for assaulting officers. Videos from the scene showcased destruction and lawlessness, sparking condemnation from Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who accused Trudeau's government of enabling unrest with its radical, divisive agenda. Trudeau, attending a Taylor Swift concert with his family at the time, responded the next day. "What we saw on the streets of Montreal last night was appalling," he posted on X, formerly Twitter. "Acts of anti-Semitism, intimidation, and violence must be condemned wherever we see them. The RCMP are in communication with local police. There must be consequences and rioters held accountable." Critics argue that Trudeau's response, issued hours after the riots, lacked urgency or clear directives. Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly issued a similar statement but stopped short of outlining specific government action. Montreal's unrest is part of a broader trend of protests linked to the Israel-Hamas conflict. Demonstrations have been criticized for promoting hate speech and anti-Semitism, with slogans like "From the river to the sea" drawing backlash for their genocidal implications. Montreal's unrest is part of a broader trend of protests linked to the Israel-Hamas conflict. Higgins highlights a pattern of government inaction, noting that while the truckers' convoy was met with the Emergencies Act, the response to anti-Semitic protests has been muted. By taking a low-key, hands-off approach, the Liberals have allowed these protests to spawn into anti-Jewish hate fests and rioting, he writes. A leadership void? The contrasting images of Trudeau dancing while Montreal burns have become a symbol of frustration for many Canadians. As public unrest grows, the demand for stronger government action to uphold Canadian values and address escalating violence becomes increasingly urgent.
The fact that there were violence on the streets of my hometown was completely unacceptable. What we saw was not peaceful protests. What we saw was actually violence, hate, and anti-Semitism, and this has no place on our streets. Of course, we believe in the freedom of speech. We believe in the freedom to demonstrate, but where we draw the line is when there's violence.
This was nothing like lawful, peaceful protest. This was anarchy. It was an engagement in violence and hatred on display in the city of Montreal. And in particular, I wanted to particularly condemn the anti-Semitic behaviors that we witnessed. That has absolutely no place in Canada. I believe that lawful, peaceful protests can be co-opted by anarchists who have other agendas. Those agendas were quite apparent by the activities of that mob yesterday, and those behaviors are unacceptable, and we can condemn them, and in particularly the hatred and anti-Semitism that was on display, in the strongest possible terms.
Well, police in Quebec made 3 arrests at a pro-Palestinian and anti-NATO protest in Montreal. The demonstration took place while the city hosts the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Linda Ward has the latest.
We know these are pro-Palestinian protesters acting in solidarity with those in Gaza, acting against NATO, mainly students. A number of protest groups have been named in this. NATO, they say in interviews that they've been doing from the crowd there, they say is complicit in supporting Israel's war on Gaza. This as 300 delegates from NATO countries are in Montreal for meetings for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. This protest last night, though, turned violent quite quickly. Montreal police say demonstrators were throwing objects at police, lighting vehicles on fire, breaking windows. Around 4:30 p.m., we have a map we can show you just how they started moving through the streets of Montreal. The crowd gathering at Place Émilie Gamelin. Around 5 o'clock, the group met another demonstration near Place des Arts, and then around 6 p.m. they began marching together. And this is when they say that they lit what appeared to be an effigy of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on fire. They were throwing smoke bombs, metal barriers were being torn down and thrown into the road. Fireworks were set off in the street. They were smashing the windows of businesses as well as the windows of the Palais des Congrès, where the NATO meeting is taking place, the convention center there in Montreal. And police say that several police officers were assaulted during these protests. At about 6:40, they used what they call chemical irritants and other techniques to disperse the crowd. Vehicles were then lit on fire. About 7 o'clock, the whole crowd was dispersed, but that is when police said that they made 3 arrests, some for assaulting those police officers, as I mentioned, and others for allegedly obstructing police work.
Okay, so yeah, quite a violent protest, as you described, Linda. But this has been growing through the week?
Yeah, so there's been a number of protests and boycotts by students in Montreal over the last week. Thursday, Friday, really a number of protests at Concordia University, but we saw students coming from McGill and Dawson College gathering there for those protests as well. Pro-Israeli counter demonstrations as well on those campuses. Tensions have been high. We heard from Defense Minister Bill Blair, who was at the Halifax Security Forum, who said some activists in the crowd have gone too far.
This was nothing like lawful, peaceful protest. This was anarchy. It was an engagement in violence and hatred on display in the city of Montreal. I believe that lawful, peaceful protests can be co-opted by anarchists who have other agendas. Those agendas were quite apparent by the activities of that mob yesterday, and those behaviors are unacceptable, and we can condemn them, and in particularly the hatred and anti-Semitism that was on display, in the strongest possible terms.
And a similar sentiment on social media from Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly as well. So we know that this protest started, the forum rather, started yesterday, goes until Monday. So no doubt police in Montreal are going to be on high alert for further protests as it goes on.
Okay, Linda, thank you.
You're welcome.